what we've been doing. We're gonna do our best to, kind of share some results and then leave plenty of time for some engagement and discussion. In the interest of kind of just getting us launched and started, what I'd love to do is just have folks share in the chat where you are joining us from. So your name and institution or organization, community, where you're joining from, and I will go ahead and get us launched here. Everyone's seeing the right screen? Good, good. All
Yeah.
right, thanks. Perfect. Okay, so here's what we're going to try and get through today. We are going to give just a few minutes of update on some of the new project activities, things that we're doing, sort of where we're sitting right now. Then I will give Hannah and I will sort of tag team some updates on what some findings that we have from looking at our multiple years of survey data. We will briefly describe some of the directions that we are headed next, and then leave time for some Q&A and discussion. So, in this sort of calendar year of this project, we have been working with funding from the Joint Fire Science Program. So this project has had funding from a few different federal agencies over its course. We started with some rapid funding from the National Science Foundation, have had funding from the Natural Hazard Center, and currently this project, which is actually, yeah, money from the Bureau of Land Management. And so that funding period started about a year ago and goes for about another year. We are engaged in a few key activities. One was that this funding allowed us to form a community advisory board to the project. We've been working informally and frequently with lots of different community partners, but this has allowed us to put more attention towards regularly meeting with a group of people representing uh, different communities that continue to, work towards recovery, and a focus on, connecting with folks who represent some underrepresented groups, including, mobile home communities, for example, and yeah, other different communities. So that has been great and good to see some CAB members on the call today. We also are planning, and we'll talk more about this at the end, some additional interviews. So this project has, again, we'll talk a lot about the survey data and some of the analyses of that existing data with the results share out. But we also have team members that have been conducting interviews with local decision makers. So again, folks that are on this call, I know have talked to people on our team. We'll be doing some follow-up interviews. Again, just really trying to understand that recovery is a long process, and so seeing where we are now and how what we've learned from the Marshall Fire is shaping efforts to build resilience moving forward in our different communities. And then also conducting focus groups with community members to get, again, a deeper sense of some of the experiences for folks that may continue to struggle with recovery processes. So here's our team. And again, most of us are on the call with you today. We represent lots of different University of Colorado campuses, so Denver, Boulder, and Anschutz, as well as colleagues at Duke. Um, a couple of shout outs actually to recent doctoral student graduates. So Nathan graduated with his PhD and is now at the University of Tennessee, and Hannah Walters. Dr. Hannah Walters finished her doctorate of public health back in the spring and has continued to work with the project as well. So hooray for those milestones. Welcome to new members of the team. And we, yeah, are excited to keep working together. Okay, so I mentioned that we formed a community advisory board. That group we were able to recruit and start meeting um, earlier this year. So we've met a couple of times and are working with that cab on the design of some focus groups. So that'll be kind of our activities for this first year of the cab. And again, we'll come back to this and talk a little bit more, get some input from all of you. You'll hear some themes throughout the session today around focusing on renters and standing home residents as two groups that, I think had continue to have some unmet needs, both with this recovery and I think in other disaster contexts as well, in addition to non-English speaking residents. And so those are three groups that we'll focus on in these discussions that we're planning. Okay, so I'm going to jump in and give some updates on survey analyses and some results from those analyses. So as a refresher or new information for folks who may not have been, are newer fans of the Marshall Fire Unified Research Survey, we came together as a team and were able to conduct our first wave of surveys with impacted residents about 6 months after the fire. So our wave one survey was conducted between May and July of 2022. So again, just 5 to 7 months after that, after the fire actually occurred. Uh, uh, for our second wave, we recruited all of the same households that took our first wave survey, in addition to a second group that we were able to, a contact list that we were able to obtain through Boulder County, so the list of affected residents. And so that expanded our survey sample. We had about 800 responses in wave one, about 1,400 in wave two, and then re-recruited all of those same folks for our wave three survey, which happened just after the 2-year anniversary of the fire, um, and got about 764 responses. And so this gives us, a good, we asked some questions consistently in all three of these waves. There were some questions that we added in different waves to really try and capture, what was happening at that point in the recovery. And, of course, we would have loved to have a larger sample. We would have loved to have all of the people that completed our first wave sample follow up and complete the subsequent waves. For those of you who are familiar with social science research, getting people to take surveys is increasingly challenging, particularly challenging for folks that are, just faced a disaster and are struggling with that as well. So we feel compared to other survey efforts, we think we've done a pretty good job of being able to capture a broad range of different experiences. And as I kind of like to say, each survey response is a story. And so all of these stories, being able to have collected, thousands of responses over these different waves, really has given us a way of hearing, more stories than necessarily, we would hear from, for example, the folks who are able to show up at a community meeting, or are interviewed for a newspaper article. So we think these data are really valuable, and as we continue to work with them, we keep learning, and we also are learning about, the things that we don't know and the groups that aren't represented in our surveys. For example, non-English speakers. Our surveys were all conducted in English, which is one of our motivations for trying to do some outreach and focus groups with Spanish speakers in particular, potentially some folks who are speaking different languages as we move forward. So those are just some of our ideas. So that's kind of framing the survey, where we have been. So the results that we're going to highlight today focus on three different things. One is this question around displacement. So obviously, we know that in a disaster, one of the most impactful things that happens is that people lose their homes or have their homes impacted in a way that makes them unlivable for some period of time. And so this leads to, people kind of, being displaced and wanting to understand over time um, whether people have been able to move back home, whether they have been able to stay, even if they aren't in the same home, if they've been able to stay in the same community, um, and how that might differ across different groups. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've learned about that. And then, as mentioned before, trying to really put our attention towards groups that may be understudied, may be underserved by existing structures and processes in a disaster. So we'll tell you a little bit about what we've learned about renters and standing home residents. Okay, so I am calling this our Where Are They Now analysis with the caveat that now is at this point about a year and a half ago. So 2 years post-fire at our Wave 3 survey. We do, as we'll talk about at the end, have some ways of combining our data with other records uh, to be able to get a more actually current, up-to-date picture of things like, rebuilding status, things like that. We know that governments are collecting some of those data, but what we are able to do with our surveys is, again, have more detailed information about these individuals and what patterns we're seeing in terms of who is in these different categories. So for the Where Are They Now analysis, or where were they a year and a half ago, what we did is to take that Wave 3 survey. And again, all of those folks that completed Wave 3 had completed, we have data on them from one of the earlier time periods as well. And um, we categorize them so we ask them, right, where they're living at the time that this, Wave 3 survey is completed. And then we also know where they were when we initially recruited them or where they were pre-fire. We have everyone's pre-fire addresses. And so what we've done is to categorize everybody to say, is this respondent at the same address they were at before the fire? Are they in a different home, but in the same jurisdiction? So meaning if they lived in Louisville before, are they still living in Louisville? Are they in a different jurisdiction, but still in or near Boulder County? We've included in this, Erie, Longmont, Broomfield, which are not officially in Boulder County, but and some of them span multiple counties, so a little bit hard to categorize. But those are included in our sort of in near Boulder County group. The green is in Colorado, but outside of that sort of near Boulder County adjacent group. And then the blue here is out of state. So what I'm showing you here, I'm going to break this down by different respondent characteristics. And the one that I'm showing you right here is by the disaster impact. So complete loss folks, pretty self-explanatory. Standing homes are people who, at the time of our Wave 1 survey, so 6 months post-fire, reported that they had damage and were not living in their home. So that's how we categorize, in this case, a standing home resident. Folks who reported that they had some level of damage, this could be some smoke, some ash, but were living in the home, those are our third category here. And then our final category are people who reported that they did not have any damage. And so overall, what we see, not too surprisingly, the folks who didn't have damage are very likely to still be living in the same home that they were in before the fire, whereas folks in these two categories who were initially, so all of these folks, 100% of them, were not in their homes at Wave 1. 37% of the complete loss household respondents in our sample, which is not, again, this is not everybody, right? But the folks that responded to our surveys over these 3 waves, 37% of them had moved back home to their pre-fire address. And notably, that proportion is lower, 27% among the standing home folks. So they were less likely to have moved home. And then if we look at, where folks are, a slightly higher proportion of the standing home residents are also in a different jurisdiction. But most of these folks are sort of still in the Boulder County area with sort of comparable levels of people who are out of the Boulder County or out of state area. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to limit our analyses to just looking, since these folks, right, mostly are still in their same homes. What I now want to do is to look for these two groups that were displaced at what factors are associated with them being in these different categories, in addition to their impact category. So again, we're limiting in these slides. You'll see if you are paying attention to sort of these sample size numbers, those are going to get smaller because we're looking just at these two groups. Oops, other direction. Let's go forward in time. Okay, so first I'm going to look at jurisdiction. And so here I have the folks who are in Boulder County, and this is unincorporated Boulder County. So these are the areas of Boulder County that were sort of in or near the fire perimeter versus Superior and Louisville. So what we see is that there's a higher proportion of folks who have returned home in Superior and Louisville compared to the Boulder County folks. We also look at this by housing tenure. So again, I've told you we're going to talk about renters today, and we did have 57 renters who were complete loss households in our survey. So this is perhaps not surprising, but what we find is that none of the renters who experienced a complete loss or severe damage that we surveyed at these earlier time points had returned back to that same address. So renters kind of once displaced have stayed in a different property and have not gone back to the same properties. And a slightly higher proportion of them are also actually quite a bit more of the renter group are outside of Boulder County. And again, the proportion that are out of state is small, somewhat small, but higher for renters than for homeowners. So the homeowners who are displaced are more likely, right? The vast majority of them are, even if they are not back home, they're still closer to where they started compared to the renter group. In terms of age, what we see is that the youngest respondents, so the 18 to 34-year-olds, and these are some smallish groups, so only 28 respondents in this youngest age group in our sample. But we see that the youngest age group is the, sort of, again, more displaced. And, again, there's multiple explanations for all of this. I think if we looked just at the general population, these younger age groups are likely more mobile and transient to begin with, so perhaps unsurprising. And what we also see is that this sort of middle age group, folks who are probably most likely to have families, kids, jobs that are more kind of place attached, are the most likely to have moved home. And finally, in terms of income, we see something again similar, and all of these things. This is sort of looking at variables one by one. We also have ways that we can look at this, in a multivariate way, so controlling for various different things. We think some of these are very likely correlated with each other, but the lower income groups are also least likely to have returned to their pre-fire address. So I believe I will leave this here. Go ahead and put questions in the chat. We are gonna leave plenty of time for conversation. So you can start putting questions in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on those. I'll hand it over to Hannah now to talk about renters.
Thanks, Katie. So yeah, the next few slides I'll share with you are really focused more on the experiences of rental costs amongst our renter respondents. So Katie, if you can go to the next slide for me. Okay, so to start off, oops, thanks, Lee. This is looking at a group of renters that we surveyed, in particular at wave two. So this is 1 year to 1.5 years after the fire. And we asked people who had not moved. So this is all damage categories, but people who had stayed in their pre-fire address. Well, I guess they would not be complete loss residents, but other impact categories who had stayed in their um, pre-fire residence, and asked them, how has your rent in this same address changed 1 year to 1.5 years after the fire? And what we've seen is what was reported to us at this time point is that 63% of this group saw some increase in their rent, whereas only 36.5% saw no change in their rent, no increase at least in their rent. And I think what's notable is that within this 63% group here who did see an increase in their rent, um, a year and a half after the fire, um, 21, a little over 21% of that was anywhere from 11 to 20% of an increase. So the bulk of these folks probably combined with the 6 to 10% increase group saw, probably close to 10% rental increase in their same residence, even if they had not moved. Katie, could you go ahead? Thanks. So, skipping ahead in time a little bit, at our wave three survey, we asked people who did move, how did your rent change? So, folks who left their pre-fire address. And what we find here is, I would say relatively comparable to what we were seeing at wave two for people who stayed at their address, which is folks are paying more in rent over time after this fire. And of course, some of I decided to break these out very granularly by jurisdiction, so some of these sample sizes are quite small, right? But and I'll actually after this I'll be sharing some qualitative data, because as Katie mentioned in the survey, every response is a story, right? So getting into those more specific details and experiences people share with us is very important. But anyway, I do want to draw your attention to the elsewhere in Boulder County group. Oh, sorry, Katie. Um, just to flag there that what we do see in that group is people who even do stay in Boulder County, a sizable portion, over 60% are saying they're paying more in rent. And generally, the largest group to have any savings in rent or pay less in rent are folks who left the county. But again, these are quite small sample sizes, so I think it's something for us to continue to explore. Um, okay, now I'm ready. Thanks, Katie. So I have a quote from you for you. I'll read it for you, but it's also up there for you to read from a 29-year-old Boulder, Boulder County resident. And also special shout out to Matthew Miller, who has been analyzing so much of the qualitative data across all of these waves of surveys. And he was so helpful bringing some really impactful quotes for our presentation today. So thank you, Matt. So this resident says, I was paying $800 for a bedroom in a wonderful home. And since the fire, I've been paying $2,000 for a crappy apartment in Longmont. The cost of living is absurd, and wages do not reflect the cost of living. It took me years to find affordable housing in Boulder County, and I am saddened that I only got to live in the affordable housing for less than 1 year until it burned down. Things can be replaced, but I am still upset about the lack of affordable housing options. I've felt this way since before the fire, but the Marshall Fire significantly exacerbated this serious problem. Um, and Kyle, to answer your question about standing home versus damage living there, standing home is people who indicated at 6 months after the fire that they had damage in their home but were not living there. Oh yeah, Katie got it. Thank you. Okay, next slide, Katie. Okay, and just to wrap up this section about renters, given what I've just shared about increased rental costs in this group, these groups is we ask everyone in the survey, regardless of whether they're a renter, owner, impact category, jurisdiction, what their opinion is, or how much they agree or disagree with the statement. As our community rebuilds, we should work to provide more affordable housing in this area. And so we have those results from wave one, which was 6 months after the fire, and then wave two, which was a year to a year and a half after the fire. And the most important point here really is that across jurisdictions, the majority of respondents show support for increased affordable housing. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to shift to just talk about another group, which is our standing home residents. Okay, so a question that we ask everyone in the survey over time is for them to tell us what was called a global distress level. So essentially, the respondent tells us on a scale of 1 to 10 what their general level of distress is, with 10 being the highest, 1 being the lowest, and generally 5 is considered high to moderate distress. So we looked at how global distress ratings at or above 5 versus below 5 may differ across impact category. So this is a snapshot at wave 3. So 2 years post fire, what level of distress are folks reporting by their damage level? And we want to flag that for standing homes, which in this slide I'm calling damage not living there, standing home is the same group. They reported the greatest proportion of distress at or above 5, compared to even complete loss. And then not entirely surprisingly, the no damage group had the lowest level of distress over 5 reported. Next slide. So the rest, and so again, going back to this idea that I think is really important to us as a research group, which is that these survey respondents have entrusted us with their stories, is to also really be diving in and doing more work with their qualitative results. So I'm going to share 3 brief stories from the from standing home residents that I think are very illustrative about why some of this distress might be happening, and some of the other trends that Katie highlighted about returning home or not, or displacement amongst this group. So a 65-year-old Louisville resident told us, smoke damage is its own kind of hell. It is not black and white like if your home burned down. Every single thing is a fight with insurance to prove your home and belongings are toxic. We need regulations and set protocols to follow after a fire to deal with smoke damage. I lived in a state of utter panic and anxiety for 17 months until I finally could move back home to a safe house. I didn't know if I would feel safe to move back until the very end of this horrible ordeal. I never knew where I would live, and that was very difficult. Next one. Similarly, a 52-year-old Louisville resident shared with us, information is badly needed for those homes that did not burn, as um, information is badly needed for those whose homes didn't burn, as they have been much ignored to focus on those who lost homes. Homes at the fire lines like ours that are immediately adjacent, many burned homes, toxins have been given little direction on how to safely remediate homes and yards. We have no idea if our home yard will be safe for our family following remediation. Will we be facing cancer in the future as a result? As the remediation restoration process was poorly informed, chaotic, and most remediation/restoration companies overwhelmed and doing a poor job. I think I have one last one. A 62-year-old Boulder County resident shared with us, unincorporated Boulder County resident said, because I was partially damaged, I thought I would be repaired and back in my house by now. Little did I know that the damage cracked open Boulder County codes and I've had to completely gut my interior. Energy upgrades have necessarily contributed to a virtual rebuild of my structure without the benefit of being labeled a complete loss. The fire's 10% structural damage has led to a 90% rebuild procedure with an overall cost of over $750,000. surreal. So I think together, these show both the distress and lack of guidance that respondents are reporting around how to handle these gray areas of damage from smoke, ash, toxins, and then also the financial burden that can come from having to rebuild a home or remediate a home to meet certain energy standards. Okay, next slide. And these are our takeaways. Do you want me to do this, Katie, or did you want to?
Yeah, I can jump back in.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I'm loving the questions that are in the chat. We want to get to that discussion. So I'll just be really brief in kind of sharing some of the things that, have stuck out to us. One is I think, we didn't necessarily show this today, but I think many of us have seen some of these comparisons between the pace of rebuilding in the Marshall Fire affected areas compared to other disasters, including other fires and hurricanes, other things like that. And those generally show that that we're outpacing a lot of those other areas, which is great and good news. And at the same time, I think it really is important for us, in communities that, have, I think, a lot going for us in terms of ability to recover from a disaster like this, to understand how the recovery process is playing out and whether we are, doing everything we can to bring everyone along with that. And so, looking at some of the data that we've presented today, we're seeing some groups that were less likely to have been back in their homes, and in some cases back in their communities at 2 years post-fire. I think some of the questions that are being raised in the chat are really important in terms of how does this, there are kind of a couple things. One is, how much of this is just sort of normal turnover, right? And things that would be happening anyway. And so I think there are some ideas that we have for that. And also, if all of that is kind of in terms of thinking, I think a lot of us have been thinking about, how is this disaster changing sort of the overall composition of our communities, and who is able, who does, who our neighbors are, right? Um, and so knowing something also about, who has moved into the community. That's important as well, and something that we haven't been able to do with these data. And then, yeah, just these points on rent increases, and those rent increases affecting folks that did not experience damage, just sort of the general, raising of rents. Again, some of that is, I think, teasing apart how much of that is driven by this disaster versus overall underlying trends, across the state or region. That is also important. Um, and finally, yeah, I think many people on this call have been champions for standing home residents, and I think this disaster has, allowed us to draw some lessons that have been, highlighted and reinforced in subsequent disasters. Very notably, LA has a huge population that is now experiencing um, these same challenges. And so I think that, puts additional motivation to us for understanding what we can about what that experiences look like, and importantly, how we can do a better job of helping folks that have experienced these types of impacts. So I'm just going to give you a quick preview of where we're going next. I already mentioned our focus groups. Here are some of the groups that we're going to be focusing on. I also mentioned, that we will be doing another round of local decision maker interviews. So several folks on this call should anticipate hearing from us about scheduling interviews, and we just ask you to get back with us and have a good chat. It's always hopefully enjoyable for everybody to be able to share and reflect on where we are at this point. And finally, yeah, actually, there's again some great notes in the chat already, so we'll kind of kick off here. in terms of some things that we can do to combine our data with other administrative or government data sources. So we didn't talk a lot on the call today about sellers. That's another, group of folks who have um, who decided to sell their homes and trying to understand better at both within the sample of our survey for people who maybe didn't answer questions at all data points or things like that. But then also this does give us an opportunity to look and do some of these comparisons and say, how does the rate of home sales compare within these different areas that are potentially more or less impacted by the fire. And also, again, another thing that we didn't talk about today is the building codes. So in terms of thinking about the impacts of this disaster on who lives here and also what sort of the built environment looks like post fire. That is something that I know other folks have also been looking at and I think again we have an opportunity not only to say how many homes, what percentage of homes were rebuilt, say to the 2021 codes or net zero, but what are some factors that facilitated or hindered folks' ability to do that? We do have a proposal into NSF that we are eagerly awaiting word back on that would allow us to look at some of these things, particularly expanding this focus on standing homes, as well as kind of looking at networks and how people are learning from each other and learning, sharing these lessons across different disaster impacted areas. So you say yeah, we could all use your thoughts and prayers on pending funding from the federal government. Okay, so I will just throw these up here. I'll leave these questions up for a second and then I'll probably just take the questions down so we can see each other's faces and have a conversation. But yeah, lots of good things coming out in the chat. I'll just invite folks to come off mute and have if you have responses to any of these questions. So again, the work that we're going to be doing with reaching out to and having more in-depth conversations with renters, standing home folks, and non-English speakers. If there are things you'd like to learn from that, questions you think we should ask in those conversations, and then building on a lot of what folks are putting in the chat. How can we kind of go into more depth with some of these analyses around who has stayed and gone and why. Yes, AJ's computer.
Hi, this is Anne Marie Jensen. I don't know if this is true in Louisville and Superior, but I've been working in Lafayette on the land use rezoning that they're doing. And I believe that they have learned something from the Marshall Fire, which is that the restrictive zoning makes it harder to be flexible when you're rebuilding. And you can only build like exactly what was there or something very similar. And so in their zoning code, they are changing a lot of things to make flexibility after a disaster. And I'm wondering, is anybody talking about that in other areas?
Great question. I wonder if any of our Louisville folks who are on want to speak to that, or we can try and follow up. Well, we'll take notes and see what, if we need to follow up to get answers, we can do that too.
Well, and it's complex, that what changes you would make.
Right.
And it's also political, right? And it,
Yep.
it gets into NIMBYism and all kinds of other things. But I think there's been some lessons from the fire that I know Lafayette is incorporating, but I don't know if Louisville and Superior are.
Anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah, I can try to
Kyle.
respond from the county's perspective, Katie. This is Dale
Great.
with Boulder County, and we do build flexibility into the code after a disaster. So we've unfortunately had experience in several of these, and try to allow for understand that people often don't want to build the exact same thing, but still trying to control and protect the environment, protect those areas that are really important. So it is, as I think just heard, it's complex to try to do, but building that flexibility into the code, I think, is an important thing so that people can get back in quicker. I think it's really helpful.
So did you actually make code changes post-fire?
We did. We made so we have an initial set of codes that that is implicated when there's a disaster declaration. And then as part of that, we then take forward code amendments based on that specific disaster. And we adopted specific amendments for the Marshall Fire, I think, in April of 2022, that went into effect that allowed more flexibility from just rebuilding what existed. It allowed some size increases, some changes in location, and things within certain parameters. And we've done that after several of the disasters now. We've got what's called Article 19 of the Boulder County Land Use Code that has those regulations for those different disasters, and you can look at those. I'm happy to chat with anybody about that as well.
Well, in general, I'm kind of curious about people who were underinsured and who might have wanted to build something less expensive or as fancy or as large as what they had there, and found it didn't meet the code or the HOA requirements or any of, and they ended up selling because they couldn't afford to build exactly what was there because they were underinsured. And I'd be really curious if what you experienced in Boulder County did anything to help those folks.
I think we tried to as much as possible with the codes. I think the building code is a really important health safety piece, and we don't relax that part of the code at all post disaster, but we do recognize that people may want to do something's less impactful if it's smaller. We try to make that as streamlined as possible and get those through the process. That's usually fairly quick and easy to do, but each case in the county is a little bit different too, because our parcels range in size from 10,000 square feet to 35, 40 acres. So there's so many different issues too that we're dealing with that aren't often there in the cities. So
if I
Well,
may, or sorry,
maybe
go
we could
ahead.
ask a follow-up question of people if when they were the people who didn't rebuild, if there were flexibility in the codes, would that have helped them?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Lisa, did you want to go
Yeah, I'm happy to
and
chime
then
in a
I'll go
little
next.
bit
Kyle's
on
question,
behalf
please.
of, if it's okay with Sama and Diana, I don't want to step on their toes, but just some of the things that we did in Louisville. We adopted what we coined the recovery variance. So while it didn't allow like duplexes or triplexes or additional units on any given property. It did allow additional flexibility from certain setback and design regulation standards, which, we heard a lot around, the majority of these homes were two-story homes and maybe the desire for a primary bedroom on the main floor. So it allowed for an increase in kind of lot coverage or more flexibility in the footprint of the home. And I think initially in the first year and a half, we had, I want to say, well over a third and potentially up to 40%. I can't remember the number off the top, take advantage of those recovery variances. Beyond that, we had a number of homeowners that really desired to add an ADU on their property. And as you probably recall, ADUs were not legal at the time, but we did not prevent homeowners from adding facilities that could be converted to an ADU in the future. And so we basically would approve a plan, even with like a full kitchen and a basement, in anticipation of we saw the writing on the wall of where the state was probably taking us, so that converting to an ADU would be fairly straightforward. So we essentially approved the plan saying this is not an ADU, but that all of the structure itself was designed that way. So, but your point is well taken in the fact that the time to discuss these types of changes immediately following a disaster is complicated and political. And to the degree you can set it up ahead of time is great. I'm not aware that the cities in any of the communities were a barrier for somebody that's building smaller. If it met the building code, you could build it. I think that probably would have been more of an HOA concern, but I could be wrong and not aware of a barrier that maybe we unintentionally had.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Representative Kyle Brown, let's go to you. You're on mute. Oh, Kyle, you're muted.
After so many years of COVID, I didn't know that. Thank you. First of all, Katie, thank you for this work and all the work that you've been doing. This is really a great presentation and a lot of important information for policymakers in particular. I think Anne Marie raised an interesting question, which is sort of the correlation or the potential causation of underinsurance and whether or not it correlated with people who were able to return or not.
Yeah.
You did income, right, which is one metric, but your insurance rates probably also may have had some impact. So that would be, to the extent to which that data is knowable or that was included in your surveys, that's interesting. I also would note, I imagine your sample sizes are probably too small for this, but I would imagine, but the sort of the racial or ethnic impact here, and it sounds like you're kind of trying to get at that with some of the, at least the non-English speakers. But that's an interesting point. Lots has been written about disasters and afterwards communities getting sort of richer and wider. And then I think, your wave 3 survey seems like it was fairly well timed in terms of the expiration of most people's ALE, right? So right around the 2-year mark is when I think people are either making a key decision about like, can we stay and rebuild or not? I do know that there were some residents who, the tail was a little longer than that 2-year mark. And so I wonder if you're planning to, put out go back to these same folks and see if that, especially for those folks who had destroyed homes or total losses, if that number of returned home ticks up even more a little bit among those folks. Anyway, so those are the 3 things that I would, questions that I have, all kinds of questions. So you can take those now or just put them in your hopper. But
Yeah,
thanks.
yeah, great. Yeah, we love these questions because, they're the things that we get curious about when we start seeing things, but we kind of have the luxury of just being curious about a lot of things for the sake of being curious about them. Again, yay, science and academia. We still, that's what we get to do for as long as we still exist. But, we also don't want to do that in a vacuum of only being curious about things for the sake of being curious about them. So it's really helpful for us to know, for people who are faced with a decision about, how to do something and for impacted community members that are thinking about how they navigate their way forward. What are the questions they have? And so again, that's sort of the point of the community engagement side of this too. So yeah, and I know that, there are many questions around insurance and what role, that sector plays in, along this entire disaster cycle. So, from incentivizing mitigation to, determining where folks can or can't be insured to have a property, to these rebuilding questions. And so we do have additional information in our surveys that we can use to answer some of those. And yes, again, would love to, we're thinking a lot about what would be if and when we are able to get funding, which again, we continue to work on,
Right.
to repeat some of to go back, the balance between wanting to follow up with people that have taken our surveys to see again, where are they now, like actually now? But also, pulling in additional folks, right, to both, expand and recognize that there were people that we did not, who were here, who were not part of our survey sample, in addition to being able to understand some of the characteristics and experiences of people who have moved here since the disaster. Other questions? Are there, yeah, folks have been looking at the chat. Are there things that we want to address in?
Hey, I'm wondering if you want to take Lisa's question, because I think you could maybe expand on how, if we get funded from NSF for the fire proposal, that actually is a really great linkage to some of the
Yeah.
other work.
Yeah, so as I mentioned briefly, the proposal that we put into this NSF fire program would do a couple of key things. One is to try and understand sort of how both how we all, the folks that were, kind of involved and, engaged, again, from various different perspectives in the Marshall Fire experience, how did we and to what extent did we, look for and get information from people who had experienced prior disasters? So actually, Lisa, as you're sitting in Lions, I know that there were, a lot of conversations about how we could learn, in the Marshall Fire affected areas, what lessons could we learn from the floods and the recovery around those 2013 disasters, for example, right? So trying to look at and understanding sort of how, and yeah, big shout out to the experts on learning after disasters. So Betsy Albright, who's on our call here, and Desiree Crow, have written a book and done extensive work on trying to understand how local governments and other actors learn from these disasters and share those lessons. And so this would be an opportunity for us to look both, kind of at what did Marshall Fire communities learn from people who had experienced prior disasters, as well as how have Marshall Fire impacted folks shared our experiences with others. We know that there are really, notable kind of shining examples of our public works department, collaborating with folks in LA, actually collaborating with them pre-fire, and then being able to go in and support recovery there and in Lahaina. So we're really interested in that and how that happens both at the government level, but also at the individual level. I have, personal stories of, a good friend of mine whose neighbor lost their home here, is from LA originally, and was able to connect her cousin who lost her home in LA with her neighbor here to help, okay, here's what's going to happen next. Here are the steps that you're going to have to go through, and all of that. And so I think that that's, a really important model, both in sharing information, but also in, meeting people's needs for some certainty and guidance as they are, walking through something like this. So I don't know exactly, that I think that's something that we want to continue to look at. And I think this question, Kyle and I had coffee recently, and I think this question of, why is it, what were the factors that have allowed folks here to rebuild faster? So looking both at that side of what have we done really well and why has that worked and how could those lessons be shared, in addition to kind of continuing this focus on who isn't part of that sort of success story, and why not, and what can we do about that?
That's great. I'm glad it's connecting above and beyond all this. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks,
Oh,
Libby.
sorry to interrupt. Katie, you said that Professor Albright had written a book about this stuff, about just specifically like lessons learned for local communities. Professor, if you wouldn't mind sharing that book or all the, some of the research that you've published on that, I'd be very interested in that. I mean, I think that's one of the things that at least for me as a policymaker, we've been trying to really do is like learn the lesson from the Marshall Fire. And a lot of the bills that we've been able to pass have been like, they didn't necessarily help our folks, but they will for the next disaster. And I'd very much like to, you know, be a part of those discussions and learn from other communities as well.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And I'm happy to share. And also our website is a good source for some of the articles, but we have one paper coming out. It's been accepted and it's in the kind of publication process. The book that Katie referred to focused on the floods of 2013
Oh, great.
and recovery from those, looking at 3 different counties, including Boulder County, and 7 communities in those counties. And what was learned. We looked at policy change at the community level, public perceptions of risk and things like that. And I'm happy to, I've got extra books, so I'm happy to send one out.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm gonna put my contact information in the chat.
Awesome.
Wonderful. Yeah, and what I'm also thinking is there are a couple of things I also wanted to, I had mentioned some work that our colleague, that's the other, you know, beautiful thing about this is it's a real constellation um, of, you know, community members and researchers working together on this stuff. And so Dr. Colleen Reed did a really nice analysis looking at some of the reported health symptoms, both in relationship to how close or what people reported. So if people like reported that their home smelled differently when they got home. And so to that question of like, you know, some folks who maybe didn't do remediation or did just continue to live in their homes, you know, what were the impacts for them? And so I think her work is really that's actually kind of, you know, a lot of what she focused on is being able to connect how close were you to a burn structure, in addition to, you know, what changes in your home did you notice, and looking at how those factors influence the types of symptoms people reported. At the same time, right, wanting to be able to follow that up over longer time periods. We know that, you know, yes, we had residents who expressed concerns about cancer. That's, you know, cancer is a really hard health outcome to study because it's a long latency and you know, many factors contribute. And so, you know, we see it as a big gap in the literature to be able to actually do longer follow-up studies across multiple disasters and try and see what's happening there. So all of that to say, I think there are some, yeah, what we might be able to do is kind of put together we even could put this on our website, right? Some sort of useful resources, and then you know, share that link out with everybody. We do have our what we've learned page, and I think I'm not sure if Colleen's paper is on there, but just making sure that we've got these resources and sharing them back out with folks. Okay, well, we are about at the hour. This has been a really great discussion. Thank you all for those who were able to attend. We will also record and share this, or we have recorded, and we will share it out. So feel free to share it with other colleagues. Again, appreciate all of the local and state government folks who listened in.